That uncertainty is felt by many South Africans who are unsure about what the future holds, with no end in sight to the electricity crisis. With me to discuss the impact of load shedding on us is Cassey from Sadag. Cassey, thanks very much for making the time to join us today. Sadag recently asked South Africans to participate in a survey called My Life During Load Shedding. What prompted you to do that survey?
Thank you, Mia. We were receiving so many calls from people who were really frustrated, talking about their increased anxiety levels around load shedding. And we really wanted to understand, as a charity group, what can we do and how can we support South Africans better with their mental health during load shedding? So we did an online survey and we sent it out through all of our online channels and received over 1,800 people that responded to share how load shedding had impacted their mental wellness.
So what kind of questions did you ask them?
We were asking questions just on how they were coping, what parts of their mental wellness, from frustrations to anxieties, that they were experiencing during that time, but also wanting to understand what were they thinking about the perceived load shedding, what was the outcomes that they were seeing.
So if you look at your results, what does the data say? What did you find?
Definitely higher levels of anxiety and depression. Over 46% of the participants said that they saw their depression symptoms getting worse. Levels of anxiety. The big themes coming out of the data showing us those feelings of helplessness, where so much is out of our control, and feeling quite hopeless. And that long-term projected feelings of hopelessness was really having a negative impact on people's mental health.
So what kind of things were they the most frustrated about, and what elicited the most anxiety?
I think having such a lack of control over their day-to-day was impacting so many aspects of their life, whether having to figure out, I think in over 30% of the participants, work-related stresses, having to navigate, is my battery charged? Can I still work? Is there a network? Can I get to work? So work-related issues. Traveling was also having to deal with robots that are out and taking longer, and stressing about being late for meetings and appointments was a big thing. I think for a lot of people, just navigating that day-to-day was a real problem. What we were finding, that people were talking that they were having more levels of road rage in traffic because they were so much more frustrated, or having more arguments with families, or being snappy or short with their children. Really just finding that their levels of agitation and anxiety were through the roof.
Did security feature? So do people feel less secure because it's darker during night, there are no street lights at times, or because their security systems just don't work the way that they're supposed to work?
When you're sitting in darkness, your levels of anxiety, you're more hypervigilant. What was that sound? What is going on? So that definitely came through from the data. But that perceived fear of increased crime levels was definitely evident in more than 90% of the participants. But what was really interesting from the comments and the feedback that we received, it wasn't just perceived fear of crime or violence, but they were actually reporting real occurrences where people were sharing that during load shedding, they would have things that were stolen, robberies. There was even a case of someone who said that someone had broken into their house during load shedding while they were sleeping. So these are not just perceived levels of crime or violence, but actual reports. So we are hearing more and more people actually sharing that, which tells us that it is a real fear and it's a real reality for so many people during load shedding.
Were there indications of load shedding made people aware of the future of the country, and they became a little bit insecure about in which direction are we heading?
There is definitely an overall theme, and over 96% of the respondents really had this fear or sense of helplessness and hopelessness for the future of the country. They were already starting to question, well, what's the hope for the country? What's going to happen with my children one day? And that knock-on trickle effect of what this means overall as a state of the country was a really real fear for a lot of people as they were talking about it, really making them feel like they didn't have much control, much hope as to where the country is going next.
Did people give you any indication of what their psychological coping mechanisms are to cope with load shedding?
One of the concerning things that came out, and was the highest percentage, nearly 46% of people were actually using sleeping or napping during load shedding as a way to cope. And yet that could also be one of the signs and symptoms of depression or anxiety. We had people even sharing that when it was load shedding, they just wanted to go to sleep and wake up when load shedding was done. Those are some of the concerning comments that were coming from people using that as their go-to. Rest is definitely important, but not sleeping all the time when there's load shedding. I think that's what's key. Some of the things that people were doing is obviously trying to spend more family time together. Catching up on reading was also really important, and trying to go outside when there was load shedding during the day. So it definitely forced people away. We expected more people to say that they were more on their screens or watching shows or downloadable shows, but it actually wasn't that much, with only 18% of people saying that they would go to their screens. And I think a lot of that has to do with during load shedding, there's network problems, signal problems.
Cassey, these responses that you got are obviously from middle class people who have access to the internet because it was an online survey. Have you guys at Sadag looked at the impact of load shedding on poorer people in townships, rural areas?
So we actually, with the survey, we were actually trying to engage a lot more with people in the township area as well. So we would print the survey and send our healthcare workers to the community and working kind of door to door, especially in our northern suburbs in Joburg. And it was also really interesting insights. A lot of them, load shedding or not having power was very common, even before load shedding became a schedule on an app. They tended to have more resilience to it. Sometimes they were even saying it's more helpful now because there is a schedule, so you know when it's going to be switched on and switched off. They had some more of the hacks of how to navigate alternative power sources. And often they would say they would just pause, stop whatever they were doing and wait till load shedding was over to then continue. So I think definitely for urban areas, they've been definitely more impacted negatively in having to navigate and adjust. But in more township areas where there's a lot more kinds of those issues, we're seeing that they seem to be coping much better. Although they were more worried about crime and the trauma and during that time, the fear in more township areas was that this was going to increase more job losses and increase poverty.
That was Cassey Chambers from the South African Depression and Anxiety Group.